It is really rare that you get to look at just a single 5-year period in history and say, okay, this is where the modern world was invented.
Yeah.
But when you look at the stack of notes we have today on the French Revolution, specifically that window from 1789 to 1794, that is exactly what we're dealing with here.
It's a complete hard reset.
Hmm.
And I don't mean that metaphorically at all. We are talking about a nation that starts this period as an absolute monarchy,
Right.
ruled by a king who genuinely believed that God personally gave him the job.
Mm.
And within 5 years, they beheaded that king,
Mm.
declared a republic, and this is the wild part, decided to restart time itself.
Yeah, that is the detail that always sticks with me. They didn't just change the laws. They literally looked at the calendar and said, nope, we're done with that. It is now year one.
It is a staggering transformation. But, the mission for this deep dive isn't just to marvel at the chaos or list off dates.
Right, we're looking at the source material for AP European History topic 5.4.
Exactly. And the question isn't just what happened, but how it happened. We want to understand the mechanics. How do you go from a really hopeful liberal movement where people are writing constitutions and demanding basic rights to a regime that is actively chopping off heads in the town square to, quote, protect liberty?
That is the core paradox we really need to unravel today. How exactly does liberty turn into terror? And for you listening, as the learner, you probably know the iconography. You know the guillotine. You know the let 'em eat cake myths.
Sure.
But today we're going to connect the dots on why the guillotine became the government's primary management tool.
To do that, we have to start with the structure. You really cannot understand the explosion of 1789 without understanding the pressure cooker that was the old regime.
The ancient regime. And looking at the breakdown of society here in the notes, the math is, well, it's just infuriating.
It's a complete recipe for disaster. Pre-revolution France is strictly divided into 3 distinct classes. They call them estates. And your life, your rights, your taxes, pretty much everything was defined entirely by which one of these you were born into.
Okay, so walk us through the hierarchy. Who is sitting at the very top?
The first estate, that's the Catholic clergy. Archbishops, bishops, abbots. We were talking about roughly 1% of the population.
Just 1%.
1%, but they own about 10% of the land in France.
Wow. And what about taxes?
Virtually none.
Okay.
They called it a voluntary gift to the crown every few years, but essentially they are entirely tax exempt.
Nice work if you can get it. So then you have the second estate right below them.
The nobility, the dukes, the counts, the people with the hereditary titles and the swords, that's about 2% of the population. They own another 25% of the land. And again, crucially, they have massive tax exemptions.
Right.
They might pay a little blood tax by serving in the military as officers, but they aren't paying the everyday fiscal taxes that actually run the country.
Okay, so just doing some quick arithmetic here. That is 3% of the people holding roughly a third of the land and almost all of the political power. So who exactly is everyone else?
Everyone else is the third estate. And this is where the definition gets really important. We tend to just think peasants.
Right, guys with pitchforks.
Exactly. And yes, it was mostly peasants. But the third estate was literally everyone else. It included the city workers, the servants, but also the bourgeoisie,
Middle class.
the wealthy merchants, lawyers, doctors, intellectuals.
So you could be the absolute richest merchant in Caris, vastly wealthier than some minor country noble, but legally.
Legally, you are in the exact same bucket as the peasant farming wheat. You have no political voice and zero social status.
And that bucket is 97% of the population.
97%. And here is the core grievance that turned this entire setup into a tinderbox. That 97% bore the entire fiscal burden of the state.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around. The people with the most money paid zero. The people struggling to eat paid everything.
It's like going out to dinner with 2 billionaires, and when the check comes, they just point at you, the one working a minimum wage job, and say, "You've got this right. We're a little short."
Yeah, and the system was rigged to ensure you couldn't even argue about the bill. The notes mentioned something called the Estates General. This was their version of a parliament, right?
Theoretically, yes. It was a representative assembly. But the voting structure was completely broken. They voted by order, not by head.
Okay, explain the difference there, because this seems to be the crucial technical pivot point for the whole revolution.
Sure. So if you vote by head, every representative gets 1 vote. Since the third estate represented 97% of the people, they naturally had a lot of delegates. about 600 compared to 300 for each of the other two estates.
Right, so if you counted every head, the Third Estate could actually win a vote, or at least force a real compromise.
But the king and the nobles absolutely didn't want to compromise. They insisted on voting by order, meaning the clergy gets one collective vote, the nobility gets one collective vote, the Third Estate gets one collective vote.
Oh, I see. And since the clergy and nobility both want to keep their massive tax breaks.
They always vote together. It was always 2-to-1. The 97% of the population was structurally guaranteed to lose every single time. It literally didn't matter how good their arguments were.
That is just unsustainable. But, inequality alone doesn't always cause a revolution. Human beings can endure a lot of unfairness if they're relatively comfortable. What was the actual spark?
Hunger. Hunger is the catalyst.
Yeah.
France was broke and the people were starving.
Why was the state broke, though? Because I always picture the French kings living in Versailles, surrounded by solid gold everything.
They definitely did, but the national treasury itself was totally empty. Louis XIV had spent decades fighting endless wars. And then France spent an absolute fortune funding the American Revolution.
Which is incredibly ironic. They bankrupted their own monarchy to help a republic overthrow a monarchy across the ocean.
It's a very bitter irony. I mean, yes, they stuck it to the British, who were their old rivals, but it completely drained the French treasury dry. They financed the whole thing with high-interest loans. So by the late 1780s, half of the entire French budget was just paying the interest on their debt.
Just the interest.
Just the interest. And then nature steps in and kicks them while they're down.
What happened?
In 1788, nature intervened with a massive hailstorm that destroyed the harvest, followed by a brutal freezing winter. Bread prices just absolutely skyrocketed.
And in 1700s France, bread isn't just a side dish, it's the vast majority of the caloric intake for the poor.
Precisely. We are talking about people spending 80% of their daily income just on bread. So now you have this intellectual framework, all these Enlightenment ideas circulating in the coffee shops about liberty and the social contract.
Challenging the divine right of kings.
Yes, and that philosophy is colliding with the visceral reality of, I have no bread, my children are literally starving, and the guy in the castle pays 0 taxes.
Hunger turns philosophy into action.
That is the perfect way to put it. And that leads us directly to 1789, the beginning of what historians call the liberal phase.
Right. This is the hopeful chapter, the part where it looks like France might just become a nice, stable, constitutional monarchy like Britain.
That was the original plan. The Third Estate finally says, we are done with this rigged 2-to-1 voting game. In June 1789, they break away. They declare themselves the National Assembly. They essentially say, we represent the people, so we are the government. We don't even need the other 2 estates.
And the king's reaction to this provides one of the great moments of accidental comedy in history. He basically just locks the door, right? He tries to. He literally locks the doors to the hall where they were meeting. He thought if they couldn't sit down in their usual chairs, they would just give up and go home. It really shows how completely disconnected he was from reality.
Instead, they just walk down the street to the nearest open building,
Which happened to be the Royal Tennis Court. And right there, they take the famous tennis court oath.
Yeah, the source material calls this an act of unprecedented chutzpah.
It really was. Standing on an indoor tennis court, they swore an oath that they would not separate until they had written a brand new constitution for France. They were looking the absolute monarchy right in the eye and saying, we aren't asking for permission anymore. We are taking power.
And that energy moves from the politicians in that room out to the streets very quickly. Just a month later, we get the scene everyone knows. July 14th, the storming of the Bastille.
This is the point of no return. Rumors were swirling around that King Louis XVI was gathering the army to march in and crush the National Assembly. The people of Paris, the sans-culottes, the working-class guys who wore long trousers instead of the fancy knee breeches of the rich, they panicked. They needed gunpowder to defend themselves.
Why the Bastille, though? Was it some major strategic military target?
Not really. It was a prison, but it was mostly symbolic. It represented the king's arbitrary power. The fact that he could just lock you up without a trial, throw away the key via a simple letter. By tearing that building down, literally brick by brick, they were physically dismantling the old regime.
So you have this raw violence in the streets, but back in the National Assembly, you have very high-minded legislation happening. They start passing what the notes call the liberal agenda.
Yes, they draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen.
Which reads very much like the American Declaration of Independence.
Very similar. It officially abolished hereditary privilege. It established freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and it explicitly stated that sovereignty belongs to the people, not the king. That is a seismic shift in European politics.
But then they made a move that the notes suggest was a major strategic error. A forced error, maybe?
Yeah.
They went after the church?
The Civil Constitution of the Clergy in 1790. This gets overlooked a lot, but it was massive. The National Assembly nationalized the Catholic Church.
Nationalized makes it sound like a bank or a railway company.
That's essentially how they treated it. They confiscated all the church lands, which was a huge amount of territory. Remember that 10% figure from the First Estate?
Right.
They needed it to back their new currency and pay off the massive national debt. But it went further than just land. They made priests direct employees of the state, requiring them to swear an oath of loyalty to France over the Pope.
I can see the economic logic there. Obviously, they needed the money. But culturally, in a deeply, deeply Catholic country,
It was a disaster for public unity. It forced the average French peasant to choose between their new revolution and their ancient religion. It created a permanent split. You had juror priests who took the oath and refractory priests who refused. This fueled violent counter-revolution in the countryside for years.
But despite that growing tension, by 1791, they had technically won. France was a constitutional monarchy.
The king was still on the throne, but he was on a tight leash. His power was strictly limited by law. He had a suspense veto, but he couldn't just rule by decree anymore.
If the movie ended right there, it would be this amazing story of the triumph of liberal democracy.
But the movie does not end there. We are only halfway through the timeline. This is where we slide into Section 3, the radical phase, the slide into terror.
So what breaks? How do we go from liberty, equality, fraternity to, report your neighbor or die?
Two things really drive it: fear and war. The neighboring monarchies, places like Austria and Prussia, they were absolutely terrified. They saw what was happening in France as a virus. If the French could behead a king's authority and empower the peasants, what is to stop the Austrian peasants from doing the exact same thing?
So they start rattling their sabers, and France ends up at war.
A completely disastrous war initially. By 1792, enemy armies are physically marching toward Paris. And inside Paris, there is intense paranoia. The fear of spies, of traitors, of the king secretly helping the invading enemies. The National Assembly dissolves, and a new, much more radical body takes over. The National Convention,
Enter the Jacobins.
the radical wing of the revolution, led by men like Maximilien Robespierre. They argued that the liberal revolution was just too soft. They genuinely believed that to save the revolution from being crushed, you had to completely destroy its enemies, root and branch.
And the ultimate enemy, in their eyes, was the king himself.
Louis XVI becomes a massive liability. He had actually tried to flee the country earlier in disguise, which completely destroyed whatever trust the people still had in him. So in 1793, the unthinkable happens. The convention puts the king on trial, convicts him of treason, and executes him.
We get so desensitized to this because it's just history to us, but we really need to pause on the magnitude of that moment. They took God's representative on earth, put him into a machine, and cut off his head.
It was the total, irreversible death of the old order. France was officially declared a republic, no king, no queen. But now, that republic is under attack from literally every side. England, Spain, Austria, Prussia, they all declare war. And inside the country, you have peasant rebellions against the military draft and those church laws we mentioned.
So the government panics.
They mobilize. To keep the republic alive, Robespierre and the Jacobins established the Committee of Public Safety.
The Committee of Public Safety. It sounds like a municipal department that, checks for potholes or inspects restaurants.
It does sound harmless, doesn't it? But it was essentially a 12-man dictatorship. Their sole job was to suppress enemies of the revolution. This is the official start of the Reign of Terror.
And the definition of an enemy became terrifyingly broad.
Incredibly broad. It wasn't just royalists plotting to bring back the king. It was anyone who wasn't considered revolutionary enough. If you complained out loud about the price of bread, counter-revolutionary. If you didn't use the new, distinct language of calling everyone citizen, suspect. If you had a deck of playing cards that still had kings and queens on them, suspect.
The numbers in the notes are staggering. 40,000 people executed.
And contrary to the popular myth, it wasn't mostly rich nobles going to the guillotine. Most of the victims were regular peasants and commoners who just got caught in the crossfire of this massive paranoia. Robespierre believed that terror was a strictly necessary tool. He called it justice prompt, severe, inflexible.
While they are running the guillotine over time, they're also trying to completely re-engineer society from the ground up. We touched on this briefly in the intro of the calendar.
Yes, this is the aspect of the radical phase that I find the most fascinating. It just shows the sheer scale of their ambition. They wanted to de-Christianize France completely. They felt the old calendar, the Gregorian calendar, based on the birth of Christ, was irrational and overly religious, so they just invented a new one.
Year one.
The Era of Liberty. They renamed all the months to sound more natural. So you had Thermidor, which was the month of heat, Brunaire, the month of fog. They even changed the week. Instead of 7 days, they made it 10 days.
Why 10 days?
2 reasons. One, they absolutely loved the metric system. They were actually inventing that at the exact same time.
But right, base 10, everything.
Exactly. But the main reason, to kill Sunday. If you have a 10-day week, people literally lose track of when to go to church. They wanted the people worshiping the Republic itself, not God.
That is the very definition of totalitarian ambition, trying to literally rewire how human beings experience time just to control their belief systems.
But alongside all this domestic madness, they were brutally effective at making war. We have to talk about the levée en masse.
The military draft.
Total war. The Jacobins issued a decree basically saying, if you are a young man aged 18 to 25, you now belong to the army. They created a force of nearly 1 million soldiers, the largest army Europe had ever seen by far.
And this massive army wasn't just sitting around defending the borders.
No. They started exporting the revolution. They marched into neighboring countries, effectively saying, congratulations, you are now being liberated from your kings. Please do not resist. This is really the birth of modern nationalism. It wasn't professional soldiers fighting for a king's paycheck anymore. It was citizens fighting for their own nation.
It's this wild dual legacy. On one hand, they absolutely saved the Republic from foreign invasion. On the other, they turned France into a paranoid police state. But a system built entirely on fear usually ends up eating its own creators.
And that is exactly the story of Robespierre. By the summer of 1794, something called the Thermidorian reaction kicks in. The other members of the convention were terrified that they were going to be next on Robespierre's hit list. He actually stood up one day and announced, I have a new list of traitors. But he refused to say who was on it.
That seems like a really bad move.
Terrible move. Everyone in the room assumed they were on the list. So in a preemptive strike to save their own lives, they turned on him.
So the man who masterminded the terror
ends up face up beneath the very guillotine he used on everyone else. And with his death, the fever finally breaks. The radical phase ends.
Before we completely wrap up the narrative timeline, there's a very specific lens in these notes we need to zoom in on. Section 4. Women in the Revolution. Because the mental image we always get is a bunch of men in powdered wigs shouting at each other in assembly halls. But the sources are very clear here. Women were the actual engine for a lot of this change.
Absolutely. They weren't just bystanders watching the men make history. In fact, one of the most pivotal moments of 1789 was driven entirely by women. The October March on Versailles.
This was early on, right? Just a few months after the Bastille.
Right. The king was still hiding out in his massive palace at Versailles, miles away from all the suffering in Paris. Now, women were the ones primarily responsible for feeding their families, so when there was no bread in the markets, they felt it first and they felt it hardest. They were furious, especially at the stories of the Queen, Marie Antoinette, living in absurd luxury while they starved.
So they took a walk.
A very long walk. Thousands of women, many of them fish market workers, incredibly tough women, marched for 6 hours in the pouring rain out to the palace. And they were just protesting peacefully. They were armed with pikes and muskets and kitchen knives.
And they didn't just stand outside the gates holding signs.
No, they violently stormed the palace. They killed several guards. They hunted through the halls for the Queen, allegedly tearing her actual bed to shreds just minutes after she managed to escape it through a secret door. And the result was totally decisive. They forced the king and queen into a carriage and made them move back to Paris.
That is just a massive power move. They literally captured the monarchy and brought it to the capital where the people could keep a close eye on them.
It proved that popular violent mobilization worked. If those women hadn't marched that day in the rain, the king might have just comfortably waited out the entire revolution from the safety of Versailles.
But here's the really tragic twist in the notes. Despite being on the front lines, what did the revolution actually do for women, legally?
Very little. In fact, it actively shut them out as time went on. We have to look at Olympe de Gouges.
The writer.
Yes. She looked at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and essentially said, gentlemen, I think you forgot half the human race. So she took matters into her own hands and published the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen.
Which argued that women are born free and remain strictly equal to men in rights.
Radical logic for the time, apparently. She aggressively called out the hypocrisy of the male revolutionaries. She asked how they could possibly claim to be fighting for universal equality while actively keeping women as second-class citizens.
And the Jacobins, these great champions of liberty, did not take this feedback well.
Not at all. During the Terror, they cracked down incredibly hard. They banned all women's political clubs, like the Society of Republican Revolutionary Women. They publicly claimed that women lacked the moral and physical strength to practice politics. And Olympe de Gouges herself, she was officially declared an enemy of the revolution and guillotined.
It's a deeply heartbreaking contradiction. Women essentially helped build the house of the revolution, and then the men immediately locked the doors on them.
It serves as a stark reminder that universal rights in history rarely ever meant universal right away.
So let's pull back and synthesize all of this. We've gone from the rigged, infuriating math of the three estates, to the soaring hope of the tennis court oath, to the absolute paranoid chaos of the Terror.
It is a very heavy story. But if we distill the key takeaways from all these sources, the French Revolution established a fundamental modern truth. Sovereignty lies with the people. It completely destroyed the idea that a country is just the private property of a king.
It gave us the vocabulary of modern politics: left versus right, liberty, equality.
But it also introduced a profoundly dangerous precedent. It showed that a state can and will use terror, mass execution, the total suspension of civil rights to enforce those principles. The Jacobins genuinely believed they had to destroy freedom in order to save it.
That is the paradox that really sticks with me here. The revolution gave the world the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is this incredible beacon of hope. But the exact same revolution, led by often the exact same people, gave us the Committee of Public Safety.
And that is the underlying question that haunts basically every revolution since.
Is it actually possible to completely upend a society, to completely change the government, the religion, the economy, even the way you count the days of the week without completely losing control of the violence that you used to change it?
That is the ultimate question. And looking at history since 1794, from Russia to China and beyond, I am really not sure we have found the answer to that yet.
Definitely something for you to mull over and explore on your own. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us into the mechanics of revolution.
Always a pleasure to break it down.
Stay curious. We will see you in the next one.